Fiat Food, a weird term, but an incredibly important discussion with Matthew. I've come across a lot of things with diet nutrition, but the food, the journey behind the food before we eat it is really, really out. All right, Matthew, man, I am so excited to be visiting, brother. So you have written a book that may be one of the most eye-opening and important reads I have ever come across. But man, what I want to do first is start out with the whole cancer connection, because you've got a very unique perspective, and that is really my kind of whole world and reason that I even have, the podcast and the Sowing Prosperity platforms, because my son was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer when he was 5. And so trying to figure out all of these things that we're going to dive into stem from cancer for me. So what's your cancer story and connection as far as kind of that foundation before you wrote that book?
When I was 15, I was diagnosed with osteogenic sarcoma in my lower left fibula. I spent about a year and a half undergoing chemo for that, and I had my fibula removed. But what really occurred to me during my period when I was sick, you have a lot of time to think. You have a lot of time to be solitary and really reflect on your life. And I intuitively had known that I had done something wrong. And I remember asking my doctors, how did I get this? How did I get cancer? And they said to me, well, we don't know. Some people think it's genetic and some people think it's maybe some environmental problem. But the truth is that we have no idea. At the time, I was an obese 15-year-old child. I grew up in the 90s under the dietary food pyramid, which, if your audience, some of them might remember, it emphasized 6 to 11 helpings of grains. Fats that were from animals at that point had been substituted out for things like Crisco, and sugar was considered relatively healthy as long as it wasn't in excess, was kind of the party line. And I had consumed so much toxic food, and I'd known I had, even though authorities were telling me and telling my parents, who were very good parents, that this was the healthy diet, that meat was now bad, and that a lot of this processed toxic junk was a healthier alternative in our food supply. I felt like my body was telling me I'd done something wrong, and now I had this sickness that had manifested in my body. So while after I got sick, my career really went into journalism, the health quotient of my body and what kind of trauma I'd undergone never left me. I've always felt very curious and trying to figure out what did happen to me, why I lost that year and a half of my life, and how I could prevent that from happening again. It did come into play in research for this book. This wasn't the reason I wrote the book, but it definitely was a contributing factor for why I wrote Fiat Food. And I think just trying to find out what happened to our food supply, how everything became so unnatural. And now it's not just cancer, but if you go to a Walmart in any part of the country and just look in line, you'll see the metabolic destruction of our neighbors and our brothers and our sisters. And it's extreme. And it didn't used to be like this, but it's happened, and we're in it. And I've become obsessed to a degree with finding out why.
So Matthew, what do you as a cancer survivor and just the deep dive, because when you said, spending a lot of time reflecting and looking back, I remember my baby laying in that hospital bed early on, and I just go lock myself in the bathroom, turn on the shower, break down and try to process, then pull it together, go back out there with him. So how have you been able to kind of package that? What is cancer, and what do you believe played into getting it?
I think my diet played a significant role, and if not the primary role. When I look back, especially in terms of seed oils, I was immersed in it. My entire diet had just a remarkable amount of toxic foods that in reflection, it would have been surprising if somehow my body functioned at a high level on that diet, more so than getting sick. Now, my sickness was extreme. I know a lot of kids my age could eat like I ate and not get the sickness that I got. So, I mean, there's obviously other factors that went into it. I think people are born with different genetics, and I think that can play a role. I think that's rather obvious, but only to a certain extent. If we just put a significant amount of toxins in our body over time, it will kill us. And it might be slower and it might be faster for people like me, like what apparently was happening. So it's kind of how I've packaged the cancer part intellectually in a box.
Yeah, I think it's just really important to kind of establish kind of the causes of that are going into it. I've got a wide range. I mean, we got a podcast dedicated to the nutrients and lifestyle, and even the quantum. One big thing on the food part that is so important that I have just not seen anybody cover is part of why it's absolutely toxic with the processed foods and things. Is the extremely high deuterium content, which is just a mitochondrial killer. And I think that's part of why the seed oils are so bad, among some other things. But like Dr. Laszlo Boros has done incredible work. And so I think that's something that I would like to see covered a whole lot more throughout, the conversation. But as far as the misleading guidelines around food and why the processed food has completely taken over the vast majority of the diet. How did you get to the point that you wrote the book about it? Where did you take that deep dive and just start putting out this incredible work?
Well, thank you. Seyfuddin Moose wrote a book called The Fiat Standard, and in it, he had a chapter called Fiat Food. And Seyfuddin's an economist, and he's one of the most remarkable economic minds in the country. So I read this chapter, and it spelled out this conspiracy between large agro-industrial companies, the government, and a religious group. And it sounded completely insane. Like it sounded ridiculous, but I had enough respect for Seyfuddin and his work that I started digging into this chapter a little bit and fact checking it. And to my real surprise, what I discovered was, if anything, he had understated the case. And when I really peeled back the curtain, what I found was that our entire food system was manipulated in around 1971. 1971 is a very significant year because that was when Richard Nixon decoupled the dollar from the gold standard. So before that, if you had paper, it represented gold and you could redeem it. It changed a little bit before 1971, but up until then, central banks could always exchange the dollars for gold. They were notes that represented gold. Nixon took away the gold standard. So now dollars could be printed in unlimited based by fiat, which means by dictate. Whenever the government wanted to print money, it could, which gave the government a lot of power. But at the same time, it caused a few problems that they had to overcome. And one of the things you'll look back on history, you'll see that people will deal with corruption from their leaders. They'll deal with scandal and they'll deal with war. But one thing they don't deal with well is our food shortages or rising food prices. You can go back to Sri Lanka in 2022, where they rioted the palace. The government had to flee, and it was over the rising cost of food. And there's been thousands of riots in the past decade, mainly throughout Europe, over the rising cost of food. So food and the ability to keep the price level low is huge to keep a population in support of the ruling class. It's not a small thing. It might be, I would rank it as one of the top two ways that government can be overthrown. And when they began devaluing the dollar by decoupling from gold, what happened was inevitably food prices began to rise a lot. And this began happening in the 70s. So instead of telling the American public, look, we need to adjust to this new world, food prices are going to go up, the price of meat's going to go up, what they did was they kind of initiated what is tantamount to a 50-year gaslighting campaign, where they instead changed the entire nutritional content of food and what they stated to the American public was healthy. And they also changed the food supply through a series of subsidies. So they began subsidizing corn, soy, sugar. And corporations were very happy to jump onto this because they can make far more profit margin off of Doritos or potato chips than they can off of beef. Beef is not something that you can print like you can Cheetos, which you just come out of a machine, you can mass produce them. And then there was another leg to this table, which was a religious group called the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And they had a religious conviction that meat would lead eventually to the downfall of the entire earth. A woman named Ellen White ran it, and she was a stated vegetarian, although she secretly ate meat. But she hired a guy named John Harvey Kellogg, and she gave him a job, and she said, you have to come up with a food that's going to repress the human sex drive. And up until then, this is the early 1900s, people primarily ate meat for breakfast, and they needed to substitute for meat. So he invented cornflakes for the express reason of bringing down the human sex drive. So up until 1970, the Seventh-day Adventist Church had a lot of followers, and it was doing pretty well, but people still primarily ate meat. What happened was in 1971, when the government was incentivized to change the food supply in order to keep prices cheaper to make the electorate happy and not rioting and burning buildings down, there became an enmeshment between this church and the government. So the American Dietetic Association, which has a huge part of establishing our nutritional guidelines, was established by the church. A protege of John Harvey Kellogg named Lena Cooper started this organization and began spreading this idea that meat was bad, but they switched. So at first it was that meat caused men to have, or young boys to have, these sexual feelings, which would lead to disease. So if you go through the literature pre-1965, all of the church members were pushing health by saying, look, meat's the cause of carnal desires, which corrupts your soul. It makes you unworthy for heaven. And in time, we'll bring about an apocalypse. And then it shifted to it's unhealthy for X. And they come up with various different reasons that are then promoted through grants given by the federal government, printed through fiat dollars. Corporations are more than happy to jump onto the same exact bandwagon because they have a higher profit margin. And with the food supply being switched from meat, eggs, cheese, like real foods, to mass-produced industrial products like Fruit Loops, suddenly food prices are very low and abundant. So if you're eating Fruit Loops for breakfast and you're eating corn type products for lunch and salad for dinner, you don't notice inflation. And you can actually eat a lot of food at very little prices. But I would argue that the effects of this transition that no American voted for and was done without the consent of the American public has been potentially more consequential in terms of human health and destruction than anything I can imagine over the past 50 years.
I'm interested on going into a little bit more of the backstory of how like saturated fats were demonized. I think you've done a really good job of that. Where I couldn't agree more is getting the fats like swapped around. I think that has been, without question, the most damaging thing. So the pushing of the vegetable oils, the demonization of butter and lard and tallow. So how did we get to the point to where people and still like today in 2024 they are believing that vegetable oils are a better option than saturated fat? Like how
I
did we
mean,
get there?
Ansel Keys was a scientist in an epidemiologist in the 50s and the 60s. And he was the most famous voice in this field in the world. And he became the voice of nutrition to a certain extent. He had a theory that heart disease, which really became on the public in the early 1900s, no one had really, there'd be doctors who'd have entire practices and never have a patient who had a heart attack. But in the 1950s, this began to change. And I don't think it's a coincidence that this is at the same time Crisco and a lot of these foods began shifting into the American diet. But cigarette smoking was also high. That is another potential factor. But Ansel Keys had a theory that it was the saturated fat found in meat that clogged arteries and then caused heart disease. He couldn't prove this. And the first few years he began pushing this theory, the American Heart Association didn't agree with him. They were all like, well, where's your evidence? So Keys was like a very charismatic character. And he did something at one, I'm going to fast forward a little bit to not bore your audience. He had a lot of studies and they were all, the difference is his studies were something called observational studies, which are kind of like handing out flyers. Science is done through clinical studies where you can control the variables and then you can actually establish causal relationships as opposed to just saying, well, this is kind of connected. And Keys did absolutely no clinical research except for one study that he tried. And it was the Minnesota Coronary Survey, where he did a bunch of research on patients who were in either insane asylums or nursing homes in Minnesota. And it was a good study because it controlled all the variables. So he said, once and for all, I'm going to settle this debate. Well, this happened in the late 60s, early 70s. It was a 4-year study, and the results just never came out. Well, the New York Times revealed that the study was found decades later. It was finally released. And one of the scientists was asked why the study wasn't released earlier. And Keys remarked that, not Keys, but one of the scientists associated with Keys at the time said, well, the study was really good, but it just didn't give us the results that we were looking for. And this is important because the study really controlled, it had 2 different control groups, one with a lot of saturated fat and one who ate all the fake fats. And it actually showed that the group that ate the imitation fats suffer from a higher mortality case. So overall, their rate of death was higher. Additionally, lower cholesterol, which we've been told has been healthy, was clearly associated through this data as a higher rate of death. So scientists have had a struggle dealing with this, and we've kind of accepted through media that saturated fat is bad for you and high cholesterol is bad for you. And certain kinds of cholesterol for certain kinds of people, when it's higher, the data does indicate that it has some negative effects, but not overall cholesterol. It doesn't. And it's fed into a narrative. And once the narrative's been established into the public, it's very hard to shift it. And I'm glad that, you're having me on my podcast, because trying to shift these narratives that are held in people's minds, I have these conversations every day with people, and it's very, very difficult. They'll say, well, aren't eggs bad for you? Of course, eggs are bad for you, right? And I try to explain that, well, no, actually eggs are very good for you. And that comes from a Lyndon Johnson Lyndon Johnson, who pushed his Surgeon General to write a phony press release when the price of eggs became too high and he was considering his reelection campaign. So what he did was he had a Surgeon General write a phony press release saying that eggs are bad for people. The demand for eggs came down, which meant the price came down because the supply stayed the same. But as a result, now we're 70 years later, you'll still hear people recite eggs are bad for you. And or they won't eat the best part of the egg, which is the yolk, which is the healthiest part. So it's in short, I know I went a while there, but it's just a very long propaganda campaign that's been decades in the making. And it's not as though, in my research, what I found out was there is no smoky room where people gather, but what it is, it's a meeting of best interests. So the church is happy because this reinforces their religious convictions. Corporate America is happy because if you're eating tons of grains, they're making more money. And the government's happy because it's obscuring the price of printing endless dollars. So they don't have to meet, but this is the system that works best for them. It has a disastrous effect on the public.
It should be absolutely infuriating to the populace when they realize what you just said. We've been told to trust the science and that the science is just settled and it is what it is. And it just couldn't be farther from the truth. I think that what you said about the only study Keyes did was not put out because it didn't prove what he wants. That's the exact opposite of science, right? Like, so Matthew, how did you become what I would consider a real journalist without the agenda, right? Like, where you're simply looking for the truth based off of the personal experience you've had with cancer, and then this just kind of trail happened. How have we lost all real journalists for the most part? And did you become a real one?
I appreciate that. That's very kind. I'm kind of old school. I've also had some very good mentors in journalism. I worked at the New York Daily News where I was a crime reporter. And in crime, when you're reporting on crime, it's a good training ground to become objective because it really is just about who, what, where, when, why, how. It's not as the modern day journalism today. I mean, I was the lead reporter for a decade at the New York Daily News, which while I was there was the fifth biggest paper in the country. I've written for the New York Times, The Guardian, Newsweek, a bazillion different magazines. So I've been in this world, and I can tell you that it's gone to complete shit. And the current journalism, there's a handful of really good journalists right now. I happen to be friends with Tucker Carlson. He's an opinion guy, but somehow he's doing more real journalism right now than any of the major networks. And it's absolutely shocking to me that it's not, I mean, I tell him this, I mean, it's not like he's doing anything that great. It's just that nobody else is doing it. And he's kind of filling this void. Glenn Greenwald is another one. He's very politically on the other side of Tucker, but he's just doing fantastic work. He's speaking truth to power. And I think what's happened to journalists today is what's happened to a lot of people. And that is that they've ceded their self-autonomy. They've ceded their judgment to credentialed authorities. And they're not as thinking independently as they were. And I think that's a real sea shift in not just the landscape of journalism, but just all society, where we are trusting people to have our best interests without doing our own research and homework. And I think we saw that with COVID quite a bit. Like, that was a turning point for me because I've interviewed presidents and senators and congressmen, and I get that they have their own agenda, but I'd always assumed a basis of rationality. But COVID kind of turned that on its head. It seemed like they weren't even pretending to care about the American public anymore. So I think for a lot of people too, it was a good eye-opening experience, a positive experience, as it was for me, because I really don't trust authorities anymore. I've always been very skeptical. I'm a reporter, but now I really don't know. and I want to
Yeah.
dig into everything. And that's part of the reason I wrote this book as well. I started writing it during COVID when they were telling us to stay home and eat chocolate and not exercise or get sunlight, which is like amazing to me. To fight COVID, we should all like just
Hunker
stay
down
home and eat
inside,
Cheetos.
eat junk food. Yeah, like
No.
it's mind blowing. So as you were going through this, what keeps popping into mind is a Charles Munger quote: "The incentive dictates outcome." And so, like, if we know what the incentive is, right, we know why they're pushing for a certain outcome. And even the flip side, if it's not this great conspiracy, um, it still dictates what decisions are being made and applied through to the point of keys. This doesn't support what he's trying to accomplish, so we just omit it. And so, man, it just is such an important message that you have, and you've done such an amazing job with supporting it. It's not an opinion piece. Like how you got like what over 200 references in the book. I mean, it's just like support after support, not this great conspiracy thing. So, what what can you kind of give the guidance of to combat this? How do we combat fiat food?
It's just kind of going to sound counterintuitive, but you you got to just basically tune these people out. So all these studies that are being released now, they come from a place called Loma Linda University, which is in California. Loma Linda University is a large hospital that gets hundreds of millions of dollars of government grants, but it's run by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So if you can go on their website, each one of their board of directors is a member proudly of this church, which is fine. My issue is that they're putting out science or press releases disguised as science. And they're terrifying people to eat the foods that we've been eating for thousands of years. And it's just like we act like we're so evolved, but we're confused about what to eat. Like people don't know what to eat. We've known for thousands of years what to eat. We never had to read a book. You didn't have to have a podcast on it. I didn't have to write a book on it. We just knew, like a dog knows what to eat. A wolf knows what to eat. Lions don't need a podcast, but our human specific diet, the diet specific for humans has somehow gotten muddled, and it's not by accident. It's by complete conscious intent from all these different parties. So my advice to people who want to eat healthy is just, it's not about learning more. It's about deprogramming. Go back to what people were eating. Go on eBay. You could buy a cookbook from 1852 and the reprints, and it's like $7. I have a whole bunch of them, and you'll find these diets that were what people ate before they had metabolic disease, before these diseases really began spreading. And people are eating organs. People eat fruit, but rarely because it's not in season very much. So, like you get some raspberries in the Northeast for a few months a year, but you're not eating fruit in Arizona in December. So these cookbooks were a good reference point for me when I was kind of working and trying to figure out what, like the way things were, what before these metabolic diseases happened. So I would advise your audience to, if you want to live a healthy life, just tune out the noise and go back to our ancestral diet: eggs, meat, cheese. I have cheat days very rarely, but I do once in a while because sugar is a very addictive substance, and I have 4 daughters and they're always having birthdays. But I can tell you firsthand that I'm probably 95% carnivore, and I feel great. Like it feels amazing. And most importantly, my cognitive function is improved. Like I can, when I'm writing a book, when I'm doing notes, so I have notes on one side and I have to type them out. I've noticed significantly I can remember more on one side to type. I know that sounds like a small thing, but it went from like maybe 1.5 sentences to now 4, which usually doesn't happen as you age, but I attribute it to just not putting the toxins in my body like I used to.
So, Matthew, how did you go from, because if you were like me on the cancer front, as you dove into nutrition, meat causes cancer, right? That is what we were told. That's how even a lot of the alternative cancer practitioners that are outside of the traditional allopathic model, they will say the same thing, right? This is parroted over and over. So how did you come to go carnivore after that experience? And just, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I'm just trying to see how does that journey, how does that path look like for you?
I believed that too. I mean, why would our nutrition experts lie to us? Why would they make these things up? If I didn't eat meat at all after I was sick for a long time because I was terrified of getting sick again. But then when I began researching this book, I understood years earlier that the processed stuff was bad, but I still ate a lot of plants and salads and thought meat was bad. So I was able to reclaim portions of my health because half the battle is just to not eat shit. Like that's a huge part of it. Like, if you just eat plants, you're not going to be long-term healthy, but you're going to be better off than eating a whole bunch of processed things. Like, and you'll feel a momentary boost. But when I began doing the actual research, I was really shocked when I learned that the studies done on meat, that because they're not, when Loma Linda University releases these studies, they're not for real scientists to read. What they are is for the media to make a headline. We read the headline and then they've done their job. And then the grants that are funneled, hundreds of millions of dollars of grants from the government to them, they feel satisfied with their money being well spent. And that's how the cycle kind of keeps continuing. But when you actually pull the studies and the real studies, the clinical research, and there is plenty of it out there, you'll find that the meat is just nutrient dense. Meat, eggs, cheese, it's nutrient dense food. I drink raw milk every day. If you would have told me I'd be drinking raw milk, I thought that was disgusting. I would never have done that. I can't get enough of it now. I drink a lot of it. It keeps my weight up. Because the one thing that happened to me on the carnivore is I began losing a lot of weight, and I couldn't eat enough meat. So the raw milk keeps me out of ketosis. So it makes me feel better too.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answered your question. My transition was slow though. It wasn't like that. The meat came when I began doing the research though. Then I switched over to all meat, all animal based.
I've had, some of the top carnivore, doctors or specialists on, Kim Berry, Anthony Chafee. They just lay out some incredible information that makes you question the narrative so very much. And then the proof is kind of in that pudding, because the people that are participating in carnivore are doing very well for the vast most part. So as a journalist, something I want to get your opinion, kind of two-part. Hopefully this isn't throwing too much at you. The first book I read was the China study that scared me to death, right? So as a journalist, I'm curious as your thoughts on that. And the other one is when we start talking about these blue zones and stuff, Loma Linda is listed as a blue zone through Dan Buettner's work. So how much of that is factual and how much of that is propaganda?
It's because, look, the Blue Zone. I mean, I've read that book. You make it. It's not science. It's observational studies. So you have these people. A lot of they'll study the Seventh Adventist Day Church people, and they don't smoke, they don't drink. So you can't control for other variables. They have good social situations. So a lot of these studies, it's not clinical research. You can't, I drank milk every day, then I got cancer. I could say, well, so cancer causes milk. That's an observational study. That's the way the science works.
Yeah.
It can cause an association, but you can't say cancer causes milk. But that's what the Blue Zone does in short. It makes, based on no clinical controlled research, which is the gold standard of research, acknowledged by every other section of science aside from nutrition somehow. And it makes these outrageous claims that they go against what they go against what we've been eating and thriving as a species for thousands of years that helped us evolve. But what I would say to your audience is try it. Just try it. If you go 30 days without sugar, just eating meat products, animal-based, eggs, drink water, and just see how your body feels, because that's science. Like, that's you're testing something, you're controlling it, and then the results will speak for themselves. Very hard to argue with it. And once I got past that first week was hard for me. I was very addicted to plants and sugar. It's just, wow, I felt amazing. But you find these people that go to a doctor, the doctor weighs 300 pounds, and they're like, I've lost weight, I feel great, I've been eating carnivore. And the doctor's like, yeah, but your cholesterol is a little bit up. You need to go back to eating the way you used to eat. And this is something that happens all the time. And I think it's kind of just an awakening for people to take control of their health.
I could not agree with you more. So I want to wrap up with kind of the solution for all this, just a little bit more. And I want to get your take, because what I have found is like that fundamental principle behind the Sowing Prosperity, plan, the protocol that we're working on is local, regeneratively raised meats, heavy on ruminants and eggs. Eat seasonal. Eat as local, seasonal, heavy meat. It's very, very simple. And there's little nuances. If you live on a coastal area, eat a lot more fish, right? Or if you live in the middle of the country, eat a lot more beef. So it's just one of those things that seems almost too simple, but I feel like it has the biggest impact. What are your thoughts on that?
Logan, be careful, man, because you can't market that. You can't sell it. It's not very profitable. It's just going to lead to people being healthy. And there is so much money invested in people being sick. A huge part of our entire GDP is invested in sickness. And what you're spelling out, exactly what you said. I can't personally eat fruit at all. Like, I think it's good to eat fruit sparingly when in season, but I get the sugar cravings come back. And then while I'm trying to work on a book, or I'm working on a story I'm working on, and I'm suddenly thinking about the gas station, which has the donuts, I get all these demon voices come into my head. But it is simple, and it doesn't take a book. And I would appreciate your audience buying my book, but they don't need to do that. What they should do is eat animals, ruminant, eggs, local, regenerative. Like, everything you said is completely spot on. And the real research, the little that gets to be done by it, because it's not incentivized. If I say I want to do a study and I'm looking for a grant that says meat is not, that tests the theory about whether meat really is, I'm not going to get the grant. So this all has to be done by private research, which is just another part of the whole cobweb of it all. But yeah, you don't need to do a million different things. You don't need to buy a book. You just need to break it back down to the simplicity as you explained it. That's the movement you're talking about is great, by the way.
It's gaining speed too, but this supports what we're saying, and I think everybody should get your book. I think it's knowledge and power based on of the facts of what's going on, what has been going on with our food. I think it's a phenomenal work. I'm so excited just to continue following along with what you're doing and diving in more.
Thank you.
I think honestly, it's something that if you reread it, you will get more out of it, because we're not the same person. The same person doesn't read the same book twice, right? Because what life experiences, the knowledge we've gained, we view it completely different. But I think that your book is a necessity for anybody that cares about prosperity. It's a must. The other thing about what you said on the private funding, Laszlo Boris has been, I think, denied 38 times for NIH funding on deuterium, because it's not something that can be made money from the pharmaceutical industry. But again, Matthew, it is probably the most important thing, especially in the context of cancer, that we need to be paying attention to. So I'm actively trying to build out businesses that we can take profits and fund private, because we can't rely on somebody else to save us. Nobody else is coming to save us. Nobody else was coming to give me answers for my son and give you answers for yourself. So I feel like there's a bigger part of the movement as we get healthier and stronger and come together to help take on the role to spearhead some of these private studies. We're going to have to support, crowdfund something to do that. But the deuterium aspect is something we've got to get wrapped around, and it's just a big deal. So, brother, what can we do to continue following you, support you? Obviously, buy Fiat Food, phenomenal book. But what's next?
Oh, thank you. I'm I'm working on another book. I haven't released that yet, though. I'm horrible on Twitter, so I'm not even going to give people my Twitter feed. I try to be clever, I try to have but I'm just bad at it. I appreciate you having me on, really. I do. And I think the work you're doing is great. And I just wish you all the luck. Thank you. And please keep me up to date on the study that you're trying to get done, and if you can get any traction on that.
Absolutely, my friend. I appreciate you so much, buddy. And I'll keep you posted on when this goes out. But thank you for your work, because it's a big deal. You kind of put a target on your back too, man.
Yeah, I did. Thanks, man. Have a great day. I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us on Sowing Prosperity. Be sure to follow along across the social media platforms, including YouTube, and be sure to go to sowingprosperity.com.